The university building was almost empty. Most of the lights had already been turned off. Long corridors stretched into silence, interrupted only by the occasional hum of fluorescent lamps and the distant sound of rain against old windows, while classrooms had abandoned behind glass doors, filled with empty chairs and forgotten notes left behind by students who had long since gone home. And despite the stillness, one lecture hall near the end of the building remained illuminated, carrying a different kind of tension, because doubt often stays awake long after everyone else leaves. A young man sat alone in the highest row of seats. Books were spread around him. A notebook filled with plans rested open on the desk. For months, he had been working towards something nobody around him seemed to believe in. Some laughed. Some questioned him. Some offered concern disguised as realism. Others simply shook their heads. And the worst part was not what they said. It was how often their voices had started sounding like his own, because repeated doubt has a strange way of becoming internal. Eventually, the crowd no longer needs to discourage you. You begin doing it yourself. The young man stared at the pages in front of him, at the goals, the plans, the future he wanted, and then he heard the sentence again, the one he had heard countless times. What if they're right? Outside, rain struck the windows. Inside, silence settled across the empty lecture hall. And beside the front row stood Friedrich Nietzsche, calm, observant, watching not the dream, but the fear surrounding it. The young man finally broke the silence and asked a question that has stopped more ambitions than failure ever has. How do you keep going when nobody believes in you? The lecture hall seemed even larger after he asked it, because some questions echo long after the words disappear. And Nietzsche did not answer immediately, because the most important answers often begin with silence. The lecture hall remained silent. Rows of empty seats stretched downward toward the stage. The rain still tapped softly against the tall windows. Nothing had changed. And yet, somehow, everything felt different. Because once doubt enters the mind, the world outside often becomes quieter, not because anything changes, but because attention moves inward toward uncertainty, toward fear, toward the possibility that everyone else might be seeing something you cannot. And the young man sitting alone beneath the dim lights felt that shift, even if he could not fully explain it, because something had been introduced that did not fit with the story he had spent months fighting against, the story that he was. Wasting his time, chasing something unrealistic, pursuing a future that would never arrive. And when enough people repeat a story long enough, it begins to sound like truth. The young man looked down at his notebook, at the plans, the goals, the ideas nobody seemed to believe in. Then he looked toward Friedrich Nietzsche, and after several silent moments, he asked another question. If everyone doubts you, how do you know they're wrong? The question carried something deeper now. Not frustration, not disappointment, but uncertainty. And uncertainty is dangerous because it often disguises itself as wisdom. Nietzsche answered calmly. He said that most people are not stopped by failure. They are stopped by the need for permission. And the words settled heavily into the empty hall, because suddenly the problem looked different. Perhaps the criticism was not the real obstacle. Perhaps the obstacle was the desire to make criticism disappear before moving forward. And Nietzsche continued. He said that many people secretly wait for validation before acting. Validation from friends, validation from family, validation from society, validation from experts, validation from strangers, as if confidence should arrive first, as if belief should come before action. But history rarely works that way. The young man remained silent, because something inside him had already begun to shift. Not confidence, understanding. And understanding is often stronger than confidence, because confidence rises and falls. Understanding remains. The rain continued tapping against the windows. The empty lecture hall seemed even larger now, and Nietzsche continued. He said that every meaningful path begins as a minority opinion. Every invention, every movement, every discovery, every ambition, at some point, only one person believed in it, and that person always looked unreasonable to everyone else. The words echoed softly through the room, because they expose another uncomfortable truth. Most people do not judge ideas by their potential. They judge them by social approval. If many people believe something, it feels safer. If few people believe it, it feels dangerous. And safety is often mistaken for truth. One of the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The young man looked across the empty rows of seats, imagining the faces of everyone who had doubted him, the friends, the relatives, the colleagues, the people who insisted they were only being realistic. And Nietzsche noticed, so he continued. He said that many people call their fear realism, not because they are lying, but because fear always sounds reasonable when spoken carefully enough. The words move deeper than anything before them, because they remove the comforting illusion that criticism is always wisdom. Sometimes criticism is simply another person's fear wearing the mask of advice. The young man lowered his eyes, because he recognized exactly what Nietzsche meant. Many of the people discouraging him had never attempted what he was trying to do. Many had already abandoned their own ambitions years earlier. Many were protecting themselves from disappointment by convincing themselves that ambition itself was foolish. And suddenly their doubt looked different. Not malicious, not evil, just limited. The rain continued falling. The building remained almost empty. And Nietzsche continued. He said that one of the loneliest experiences in life is believing in a future nobody else can see, because vision always arrives before evidence. The words settled into the hall with quiet force, because what they were feeling was no longer doubt. It was something far more unsettling, a growing realization that waiting for universal approval might mean waiting forever. The young man looked again at the notebook in front of him. The goals were still difficult. The future was still uncertain. Nothing practical had changed. And yet, for the first time that night, he was no longer asking whether other people believed in him. He was beginning to ask something far more important. Would he continue believing in himself even if they never did? The lecture hall remained empty. The rain still tapped softly against the tall windows. The rows of seats stretched silently into the darkness, waiting for students who would return tomorrow carrying new questions, new ambitions, and new uncertainties. Nothing had changed, and yet, somehow, everything felt different, because something had shifted, not in the building, not in the notebook lying open on the young man's desk, not in the opinions of the people who doubted him, but in the way he now understood doubt itself. And that difference was enough to change everything, because once a person stops treating doubt as a verdict, doubt loses much of its power, and the empty lecture hall seemed to carry that realization through its silence, because something had been introduced that did not require agreement to exist, something that had already begun to alter the way the young man understood criticism, approval, confidence, and the invisible dependence people often develop on the belief of others. And that alteration is what makes an idea dangerous, not because it removes uncertainty, but because it removes excuses. And Friedrich Nietzsche stood calmly near the front of the hall, not as someone who had never been doubted, but as someone who had stopped measuring truth by popularity. And that difference was impossible not to notice, because most people trust crowds. Very few trust themselves. The young man remained seated. The notebook was still there. The goals were still difficult. The future was still uncertain. Nothing practical had changed, and yet something inside him no longer felt trapped. Then he asked one final question. The question hidden beneath almost every dream. The question hidden beneath almost every ambition. The question that appears whenever a person stands alone. What if they're never convinced? The hall seemed quieter after he asked it, not because the silence deepened, but because the question reached beyond success. It reached belonging. Nietzsche answered calmly. He said that greatness almost always begins before approval. The words settled heavily into the empty room, because they expose something most people spend their lives avoiding. The desire to be understood before acting. The desire to be supported before moving. The desire to be validated before becoming. And Nietzsche continued. He said that if every great idea had waited for universal agreement, most of them would never have existed at all, because people believe evidence, not vision. The young man listened carefully, because for the first time that evening, he was no longer thinking about his critics. He was thinking about himself. And Nietzsche continued. He said that the crowd often arrives late, very late, sometimes years late, sometimes never. And if your commitment depends entirely on applause, then your commitment belongs to the crowd, not to you. The words echoed softly through the lecture hall because they did not promise recognition. They demanded independence. And independence is always heavier than encouragement. A gust of wind rattled the windows. The rain continued falling. The empty rows remained exactly where they were. And suddenly the young man understood something he had been unable to see before. The people who doubted him were not carrying his dream. He was. The responsibility had always been his. The burden had always been his. And therefore the decision had always been his as well. A long silence settled over the hall. Then Nietzsche slowly turned toward the exit. The corridor beyond was dark, the building nearly empty. And before leaving, he spoke one final time. He said that the greatest mistake people make is believing that confidence comes before action. Confidence comes after action, after effort, after persistence, after surviving enough doubt to discover that doubt was never the enemy. Surrender was. And the words settled over the lecture hall with quiet finality because they did not promise success. They did not promise victory. They did not promise that the dream would come true. They promised something far more important: ownership, because ownership is always heavier than hope. Hope waits. Ownership acts. And no one spoke after that, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove, nothing left to negotiate with the crowd. And as Friedrich Nietzsche disappeared into the dark university corridor beyond the lecture hall, the young man remained exactly where he was. The doubt still existed. The uncertainty still existed. The future remained unknown. And yet he no longer felt the same. Because once a person realizes that belief from others is optional, but belief in themselves is essential, they cannot fully return to the comfort of waiting for permission to begin.